testing, not to replace genome sequencing at all, but as a reflex PCR test, so a follow-up PCR test to a positive, then this new PCR test, which will hopefully be in ESR hands tomorrow, then it can be used to say whether the sample that's just tested positive is likely to be one of these new what's called variants of concern.
Well, I certainly welcome the decision, and my understanding of it is that notwithstanding the limitations that John has referred to, nevertheless the advantages are strengthened by high frequency of use and also its ease in administration, and it doesn't hurt. So that's all good, but I do have a sense of frustration. This has been advocated for a while now. And there seems to be something wrong in the connection between epidemiologists and the health ministry. And it seems, and it was put rather nicely by Professor Michael Baker in an interview he did in one of the mainstream print media outlets, where he said that we have good engagement when we are asked to respond to something that's happened, but the engagement is not good when we need to be proactive on things. And I think that if we'd had stronger channels of proactive relationships and communications between our ministry and epidemiologists and other experts, then we may well have been doing the saliva testing somewhat earlier than now. We are slower compared with a number of countries in the world, as I understand it.
Sure. So look, I think it's, in fairness, that the saliva places that are working on this, the reference laboratories, have been aware of saliva for some time. But these tests can't just be slotted straight into the work streams. They need to be validated, compared, the relative sensitivities. So, how many positives are we going to detect with saliva compared to swabs? So I think a lot of this validation work needs to be done and has been going on in the background. And I would suggest now that the reference laboratories are confident that saliva will be useful, and thus it's being rolled out. But they have been working on it for quite some time till now.
Heather, you got a thought?
It's all good news, really, isn't it? The more tools there are in the toolbox, the better off we are. And I have to say, it's very encouraging to hear you say, Wallace, that I hadn't realised that the saliva testing will be used daily now at Jet Park and other very high risk areas. So that's hugely encouraging. And to take John's point, it does take time, and we've been very impatient for vaccines, very impatient for rollout of all sorts of things, and sometimes we do just have to be patient. But yeah, good to hear that those things are there now.
Very nice to have you on the program, John. John Mackay there, who is the Technical Director at DNA Diagnostics on saliva testing, and they're developing new DNA tests to specifically detect these more transmissible stains. Just a minor correction too, it was stated earlier on RNZ National that the government has now allowed butchers, greengrocers and other primary food retailers to open during level 3 if contactless. There you go. And a newsflash, the government could change the settings regarding which border or MIQ workers are high risk and therefore are regularly tested as a result of this latest discovery.
Are they listening to this program, Wallace?
Hey. I don't know. Maybe they have their one earphone, and maybe the Prime Minister's got the one earphone, and Ian, I don't know.
I can see Ashley out the door.
Right, okay. 11 to 5, the panel. Now, in other news today, US President Joe Biden has urged Americans to defend democracy following the acquittal of Donald Trump at his second impeachment trial, saying the sad chapter in our history has reminded us that democracy is fragile. A verdict, Donald Trump was acquitted by the Senate, a verdict that underscored the sway America's 45th president still holds over the Republican Party even after leaving office, reports The Guardian. With us is freelance journalist Simon Hampton in the US. Simon, welcome.
Kia ora, Wallace.
So he's been acquitted, I guess not entirely unexpected news?
No, not really unexpected. I think when the Democrats turned down the chance to call on witnesses late in the trial. It sort of sealed the deal that Trump would be acquitted. I think they'll sort of claim a bit of a victory, perhaps in the fact that 7 Republican senators jumped across and voted to convict him, but that, of course, wasn't enough to get the 2/3 of the vote that they would need to convict the former president. There is, I guess, a sense within the White House maybe now that having this trial over is a good thing, though, even though it's not been the desired outcome that the President Joe Biden and his staff would have wanted. But I think it gives the White House a chance to focus on the coronavirus stimulus package that they're trying to pass now and rolling out the vaccine as well.
Yeah. Nonetheless, the videos of the Capitol being stormed, I mean, pretty chilling stuff. What sort of reaction did it get stateside?
Well, it really sent shockwaves through the country, I think. It was quite surreal to watch it all unfold. And I remember on that day, January the 6th, sort of sitting there in disbelief, watching what was happening. We'd seen sort of things, escalate at times over the course of Donald Trump's presidency, but this was sort of one of those moments where it just boiled to a head, and you couldn't quite believe it. And still we're seeing video footage released. We've seen some in the last few days, actually, from inside the Capitol building of leaders being ushered out as rioters stormed the building, and it's still very surreal to see that footage, and you can't help but wonder sort of what might have happened if things had been a bit different, because a lot of these people did get very close to some of the political leaders in this country. So it was really did send shockwaves through this country.
Now, the New York Times just reported that the Republican leaders are bitterly divided over Trump's future influence. What can you tell us there?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think there is still a belief, probably in the Republican Party, that Trump holds a strong sway over things. And I think you see that in the fact that only 7 Republican senators jumped across and voted to convict him in this trial, when earlier on, immediately after the insurrection in early January, it did sort of seem like there might be quite a lot more than just those 7 that voted that way. So I think a lot of senators are wary with midterm elections coming next year in 2022 for the House and Senate, that Trump could have a big part to play in that. And, of course, looking ahead to another election in 2024. So whether or not he still holds a big sway is probably remains to be seen. I think perhaps with his social media presence all but extinguished, there's certainly he's struggling to have the same grip he had over the American people. But I think there's still perhaps a belief or a wariness in the Republican Party that he could still have a strong influence on things.
Indeed. Simon Hampton from the US. Simon, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Just a really brief response on this around the panel. Trump, is this the last we've seen him or not? Ian Powell.
Well, probably not. I was struck by the comment in one of the articles in The Guardian that he might be more attracted to the lure of the golf course. You might find that irresistible. I think it's been irresistible ever since he became president. But it does highlight, I think, though, the lack of a remedy in the American political system to deal with a corrupt president. And it's only impeachment. And impeachment is such a rarity, and also it's become clearly much more partisan before and certain power blocks come into play. So maybe they need to rethink legal remedies that don't involve the impeachment process when you're dealing with this sort of situation.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's still possible action to follow too. There's, maybe civil litigation and whatnot. But it just sort of struck me that if the acquittal shows that the majority of the Republican Party is behind Trump, and the result of the election shows that the majority of Americans are against him, then is the Republican Party a party in decline? But what would please me most is, if we just all stopped talking about him.
6 to 5, the panel are NZ National. Now, finally, if you do a lot of emailing, especially for work, you might have noticed some people have begun including their preferred personal pronouns on their email signatures, indicating whether they like to be called him, her, they. Now, it's not a widespread practice at this stage, but it's gaining momentum as people look to normalise conversations over gender diversity and identity. And some government organisations are leading the charge, for example, Inland Revenue. With us to discuss this is Massey University Senior Linguistics Lecturer Dr. Julia de Bries. She, her. Dr. de Bries, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
And is that how we do it? So you'll have an email sign-off and you'll go Dr. de Bries, she, her, or Wallace Chapman, he, him.
Yes, that's what I do, and sometimes you'll have a hyperlink on the pronouns to link to an explanation of what it's all about.
What's the point of that?
Well, I think what we're starting to realise in all these discussions around pronouns is something that's been evident to gender diverse people for a long time, which is that you can't always tell actually which pronoun a person uses to refer to themselves just by looking at them.
Right.
It's complicated by the fact that we don't tend to use pronouns to talk about ourselves. Other people use them to talk about us. And so this gives us a way of making our expectations of others clear in terms of how we want to be spoken of in terms of gender, which is...
Good afternoon in our socially distanced world. Just wanted to really say what good news to have 30,000 of the border staff and border-facing staff able to be immunised, hopefully starting on Saturday. If not before, there needs a real sense of urgency needs to be around the vaccinations for our border staff, but also for those who are in close contact with them, or just even the next layer outside the border staff. I'm looking forward to having the vaccine properly rolled out throughout the whole country for the 5 million people. But that is very good news. So we are obviously concerned that, as I'm sure most New Zealanders are, as to just how this particular community outbreak has occurred, and I'm looking forward to us being able to get the information once that's been established, and hopefully it will be established. But it is very important that we have clearly not only the vaccinations for the staff at the border and just outside it, as well as the rest of New Zealand, but also there is what is concerning is this concept of a voluntary recording for audit purposes of who is actually having testing at the border. That seems unusual, and it's something that Chris Bishop, our COVID-19 spokesperson, would want to speak about. Yep.
So I think the point Judith makes is the correct one, which is that I think most New Zealanders would rightly expect that there is testing at the border of our border-facing staff. There seems to have been a question as to whether or not the person at the centre of this latest outbreak should have been tested or not. The suggestion last night was that they should have been, and then it's been clarified that they're actually outside the scope of the order today. Our strong recommendation is that that order, if indeed it was outside the scope of this particular person, that order be widened so that everyone, no matter if they have contact with international airlines or airline travel, anyone working in and around the border, no matter which part of the company, they are tested. And secondly, our strong recommendation is that the auditing and monitoring of the companies, private and government, working at the border be significantly tightened up. It's very concerning that to hear from Dr Bloomfield and the Prime Minister today that essentially the system is an IT system has been made available for companies to use. That's good. This particular company chose not to use it. That's disappointing. Our suggestion is that using the system provided by the Ministry should be mandatory, and then furthermore we would suggest that the monitoring and auditing by the Ministry actually take place. And I think most New Zealanders would expect that. I heard the Prime Minister say, I think last night, what her expectation was that people would do the recording and comply with the order. Expectation is fine, but we really do need to make sure that actually takes place.
Do New Zealanders deserve to have all of our border tested for wetness?
Sorry? All of our border...
All of the border workers to be tested for no wetness?
Yes, I do think so. I think it's, we've just obviously had this now for about a year in our community, COVID. It is a year on, we're in our third lockdown. It is simply not acceptable for New Zealanders to be forced into lockdowns, which we have to have when we find out that not all border staff are being tested, that the auditing of who is being tested seems to be slightly voluntary. None of that is acceptable, and these are opportunities for us to learn as a country and to do better. And looking at the positive, we have some vaccines coming in for 30,000 people. Well, that's a good start, but a year on, we can't afford to have people not being properly tested.
So how wide would you make the scope around that? Because in this case it seems as though this worker wasn't deemed airside because of, I guess, where she was working, yet she was dealing with blankets, sheets, linen, napkins coming off flights. So, I mean, how far do you have to widen it with private and public companies in order to, I guess, capture everything?
Well, I think you have to take specific public health advice on exactly how you would word the widening, but I think most people would agree the widening should include the part of the company at LSG that this particular person was working on. I mean, at the end of the day, she has COVID, and presumably she was outside the scope of the original order because people thought that it would basically be impossible for her to get it, and she has. So, I think people would I think rightly think the scope of the order should include that part of the company and anyone in a similar profession and other companies working at the border, because my understanding is LSG Sky Chefs is not the only company doing this sort of behaviour.
Anyone who is dealing with anything that comes from a plane or from an MIQ facility should be within that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how quickly should the government be acting on that?
Well, Parliament is sitting this week, and actually we are reconfirming some of the various public health orders in the House this week. So the government does have the opportunity to both reconfirm those orders, but also to potentially expand the scope of those this week.
We would be very supportive of that. And I think that, the woman at the centre of this who's had this terrible virus that she's now got and members of her family, I'm sure she would want to know too. I mean, she wants to know whether or not she's safe.
How surprised were you that things like the IT system weren't mandatory, and what kind of danger does that pose?
Well, look, frankly, I was surprised. And look, without pushing the comparison too far, it does feel a little bit like the August situation last year, where ministers had an expectation that particular things were happening when perhaps they weren't. And I think we're in a similar or analogous situation here, where I suspect people assumed that there was monitoring and checking going on of border-facing workers, and that the testing was firstly being done, and also that we were checking that the testing was being done. And actually, as it transpires, and it's taken, unfortunately, another case of community transmission for us to discover that, yes, there was an IT system, but it was voluntary to participate, and unfortunately LSG Sky Chefs didn't participate, and so it was a voluntary system, and also the Ministry of Health hadn't been doing any monitoring and auditing of exactly what was going on.
Is the government expecting too much of business, and is it being too trusting of business that they'll simply comply if someone says something, not if it's mandated?
I think it's a bit like asking people to voluntarily pay tax rather than having a requirement for it, or voluntarily keep the speed limit with no bad outcomes on it. You've got to actually, as a government, take a stance. Either it's serious or it's not serious. And actually, ultimately, we have a situation where a third of New Zealand is now in lockdown. 3 people have got this awful virus, maybe others, and we're talking about whether or not people who should be testing their staff and whether or not they should be filling out an online form to say that they have tested their staff. I don't think there's an issue here. It has to get done. It has to get done properly. And I can't think of all the businesses and all the employees whose jobs and livelihoods are now on the line again in Auckland will be saying, I'd rather not fill out a form. Of course they'll fill out a form.
I mean, put it this way, it's compulsory to fill out tax returns. Many businesses do it online, and that's a requirement government places on many businesses. You've got to fill it all out, you've got to pay tax, and then I'll tell you what, if you don't pay, the IRD comes calling. Well, it should be no different. In fact, it's even more important when it comes to the border that you fill out the form, and the Ministry of Health in this case comes down the line and says, are you actually doing the testing?
So in that case, where is the Ministry of Health then?
Well, possibly not getting advice from people who know how to get people to do things, like the IRD. Maybe that's the issue. But I just think it is. There's no point saying, well, we're going to get the employers to do it, and then having a system where they say, well, you can as an employer, decide whether or not you fill in a form, and then saying, well, gosh, they didn't fill in the form. So that's just ridiculous. I think the thing is that the Ministry of Health it's had a year to get it right, and we're always going to find systems and parts of the system that don't always work that well. But it's pretty basic, I would have thought. If you've got auditing, do it properly.
We've had reports previously, I think the one that Judith and Megan Woods did initially, and a large part of it was about the lack of communication within the Ministry of Health. So, I mean, how much of this is, I guess, an over-reliance on businesses actually ticking boxes and doing what they need to do, and whether there's actually a flow of communication through the Ministry of Health to actually pass on accurate information?
Well, I think that's one of the things Chris might want to talk about with the Heather Simpson and Brian Roach's report. Has anything been learnt from it?
That's right. And look, I think there are real issues to do with that. And, you know, the Brian Roach, Heather Simpson report was presented to ministers in September. That was a draft. That then sat with the minister for quite some time. I understand there was quite a lot of back and forth between people who were subject to the report and the report writers. There was a degree of back and forth that's been publicly established through the Parliament. Finally, the minister got a final report in late November, but it still took the better part of a month for that report to become public. And so, you know, you go back to September. Government's been more than aware of some of the issues to do with the communication by the ministry, the effectiveness of the ministry in dealing with multiple fragmented parts of government and at the border. These problems, I suppose the point I'm making is these problems have been reasonably well known. We're now in mid-February. That's 5 to 6 months on from the first draft of the Roche-Simpson report. I think I'm being fair in saying that's more than enough time to fix some of these problems. That report was pretty damning, and I think there's real questions for government as to exactly what recommendations have been followed up on and how that implementation is going, and that's certainly something we want to get into in the House in the next couple of weeks. Sorry.
Well, we've been discussing this, and it seems very much that saliva testing is one of those tools, the toolbox that should be being used. And when we're talking about private companies bringing this in, we don't understand why this isn't done more frequently in the MIQ or Managed Isolation Quarantine facilities. It seems a no-brainer to do this. And I just think it's one of those things where we can't just sort of rest on our laurels and think it's all just fine and we'll just continue. We're now in our third major lockdown in 12 months. That's actually not quite what we all expected.
Why did you make the decision to attend Big Gay Out?
Well, I was always going to attend Big Gay Out, and of course I didn't know about the situation in Papatoetoe. I hadn't been told until after that. Do you know, I think that's a good question because we didn't know anything about it and what had happened. We just were told that Jacinda Ardern had gone or hadn't been there or something. And, I just think that if the Prime Minister or if the government had any concerns about community transmission at the Big Gay Out, then they should have actually told the organisers and closed it. Yes.
Yep.
You mentioned, New Zealand, Auckland's its third major lockdown. I mean, other parts of the world have been in lockdown on and off basically a year, more on lockdown than off lockdown. Are you sort of holding New Zealand to an unrealistic standard?
Well, I guess I'm very concerned for New Zealand because we are one of the most physically isolated countries in the world. We have tremendous control over who comes into this country. And we have mechanisms in which to actually implement that. We're not subject to land borders and people sneaking over them or anything like that. But we also have a very small population. We also have a very small economy compared to other countries. And smaller economies tend to get hit harder in some ways. And we've done remarkably well considering what could have happened. But we can't just continue to, we can't rest on our laurels. We have to take these things very seriously. And the other thing, it's not just about that, it's the fact that actually every time this virus comes in and someone gets it, catches it, becomes infected, and their family members do, they end up with health effects that they never anticipated. And actually, we should think about that too. It's not impossible for us to always be seeking to do better. And actually, after a year of it, I think we can do better on a few things, particularly as the technologies are improving.
The end of the last lockdown set off the chain of events that essentially led to the political management at the end of the last lockdown, sorry, the first lockdown, I should say, set off the chain of events that led to signing of bridges with Fred Thomas nationally, because there was a sense that from the public, and he did respond to that particularly well. As the national leader now, have you learned any lessons from how?
I think it's really important. Obviously we're not in an election year, so it's slightly different, and we're now into our third lockdown. I just think it's always really important that where we can support the government on what we think they're doing well, we should absolutely do that. And that's why I started off today saying it's really good news that we've got enough vaccines apparently coming in right now for 30,000 of our frontline staff on the border and MIQ. That's great, and we need to do better with these other things. But part of being a good opposition is also pointing out where there could be improvements and actually holding a government to account. And in a democracy, that is utterly crucial. And so you'll always see us giving praise where it's due and helpful suggestions and occasionally criticism where it's due to. Did I what? Well, I'm happy to tell you, I've actually been on media already today saying that we were not sure that was necessary right at this stage. It might become necessary, but right at this stage, we thought we've got question time this week. We've got select committees are still meeting. While that's still happening, it may not be needed. But look, we're keeping an open mind. You're in the committee.
Yeah, but Judith has neatly summarised the position. The Minister of Health, the Minister of COVID Response, formerly the Minister of Health, Mr Hipkins, has indicated he's very happy to brief a select committee this week, and so I've requested that he appear before the Health Committee, which meets on Wednesday, to discuss the events of the last couple of weeks and some wider matters as well. And I hope that will be favourably received. We'll wait and see.
Well, I think that they're probably trying to see whether or not the lockdown continues. I mean, if the lockdown's for a couple of days, that's tough enough for people in the hospitality sector, butchers, people like that. It's going to be tough enough for them. But I think a couple of days is probably okay for most people. But if it goes on much more than a week, I think that we're going to have to be encouraging them to do the right thing by those small businesses. Right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.